On today's Wide Shut webcast, we explore exactly why Tommy Robinson was jailed for contempt of court, the absolute circus of misinformation that surrounds the story, and how it's being exploited by those with political agendas.
It's the Wide Shut webcast.
So by now the Tommy Robinson story is well and truly entrenched in both the online and mainstream media. Everyone looking to capitalise on the traffic and the hits and the views. I don't necessarily remove myself from that equation, but hopefully I'm going to be a bit more honest in my approach, because this is a circus and I'm going to explain why it's a circus, what this misinformation is, and what I think some of the agendas at play are. Is the former EDL leader an innocent journalist exposing Muslim child grooming gangs when the mainstream media won't? Was his arrest a political move to silence him? Is free speech dead? Is this George Orwell's nightmare come true? No. Let's break this down. Tommy Robinson was jailed not for filming. You can film outside court precincts. He was jailed for contempt of court, for confronting defendants in an ongoing series of trials. He used numerous phrases during his livestream that implied the men were guilty before a jury had found them guilty. And he asked about their verdicts and said he was going to report the verdicts when they were eventually reached, which would have prejudiced the other trial in the ongoing series of trials. He also said certain men were in court charged with crimes that they weren't, because he was reading news reports from last year from the preliminary hearing at Magistrates Court, which is now out of date. And importantly, he was also already on a suspended sentence for contempt of court and has a history of getting in the way of ongoing trials like this. He risked prejudicing the very case he claims to want justice for. Tommy Robinson and those that support him are actively working against justice in child rape cases. I'm going to come back to this and break it down bit by bit, because it is complex and the average person isn't really taught how all of this works, how the law and the courts and the justice system works. You know, I only know about this because I recently did a law course for journalists. But the key point here is, this wasn't some radical, unprecedented event, some kind of state kidnapping or political imprisonment. If any journalist or member of the public did what Tommy did, there's a strong chance they also would have been arrested. Contempt of court grew out of common law. Common law contempt is still a thing. It was alive and well during George Orwell's day. And its whole purpose is to ensure people accused of crimes get a fair trial, and those trials go ahead without being interfered with. So let's break this down. Under the most recent Contempt of Court Act 1981, someone may be in contempt if they create a substantial risk of serious prejudice or impediment of court proceedings. In other words, if there's a high risk that they'll influence the jury or witnesses or otherwise prevent a trial from running smoothly. And that also includes physical actions such as blocking people from entering the court, shouting out in court from the public gallery, and things like that. So how does this apply to the media, or anyone for that matter, because the media is now social media, it's people with websites and blogs. No matter what the format, if you reach other people, that counts as publishing under contempt of court. So how does it work? Well, when a case is active, which is from the point someone is arrested until they're released, or if a trial goes ahead and that trial concludes, it's all that time in between. And during that time period, you're not allowed to assassinate the accused's character. So if someone is arrested for assault, You can't publish a big long article about how they look like a thug and have interviews with people who say that person was violent towards them at school, and they were always playing violent video games and this must have influenced them to do the crime. Because that's prejudice. And you certainly can't say that they're guilty or even imply that they are when they haven't actually been proven guilty in a court of law yet. They could be innocent until proven guilty. So you can't say Mohammed was arrested for rape, therefore he's a dirty rapist and I'm exposing rapists, because he hasn't been convicted of rape, and because a future jury could read that or watch that, depending on how you publish the content, and be influenced by it. You also can't bring up past convictions, because the accused should be judged on the facts of this case, regardless of what they've done in the past. You're also not allowed to publish evidence that isn't part of the trial. So maybe you've done some independent sleuthing and think you've uncovered something, or you've had a long interview with a witness who explains what they saw. You can't publish that when a case is active after an arrest has been made, because you don't know what evidence is going to be used in the trial. And if it's not used in the trial and you've published it, then it could influence the jury. And like I say, this is only when a case is active, after an arrest has been made. Before an arrest and a trial goes ahead, it's your job as a journalist to try and find out what happened and speculate if that's what you want to do. In that case, the only thing you have to worry about is defamation or libel. So, if you accuse someone of a crime, you need to be pretty damn sure that they did it. They can sue you. But when a case isn't active, you have a lot of freedom to explore the possibilities and interview people and present your own evidence. But when someone becomes formally accused of something, or if they're arrested on suspicion of the crime, you can't be prejudicial towards them. You can't imply guilt. And in numerous ways, that's what Tommy Robinson did outside that court. And he's been convicted for doing it before. Of course, that's not to say that the system works perfectly. Obviously, jurors still might read about the case prior to being called for jury duty. They may be interested in the case. They may have read your articles 4 months ago before somebody was arrested. And let's be realistic, they probably Google the case throughout the trial. They probably talk to their friends during the trial, even when they're told expressly by the judge not to do that. That's just what people do. But that's why having strict contempt laws on the media when a case is active is one way they can limit that outside influence on a jury, because most people get their information from the media. So if you make sure it's not prejudice, then even if they do read it, it's unlikely to have a big influence. When I did jury service, it was a sex crime, and we were told quite clearly, don't try to research the case. And because it was around the time of the whole Jimmy Savile thing, we were told, just because Jimmy Savile is all over the news and he's guilty of these heinous crimes doesn't mean that everyone accused of sex crimes is guilty. You need to go by the evidence that's presented in this court only. So what people need to understand, especially overseas in Canada and America, where all these commentators are losing their minds over this, Britain takes the right to a fair trial very seriously. We don't want trial by media. And I've gathered some examples of contempt of court in action. Perhaps the most obvious one in recent memory was Christopher Jeffries. He was the landlord of a murdered young woman in 2011 called Joanna Yates, and he was arrested as a suspect in that young woman's murder, but later released. And another man, Vincent Tabak, was later convicted. But Christopher Jeffries, upon his arrest, was a victim of contempt of court at the hands of the Daily Mirror and the Sun newspapers. Eventually they were fined £50,000 and $18,000 for basically painting him as this weird sex pervert, this monster that was capable of murder. And that is not allowed. You're not allowed to assassinate the character of someone who's accused of a crime and imply that they're guilty or could have been guilty of that crime.
One moment, Christopher Jeffries was a concerned landlord and neighbour. The next, he was a murder suspect, an innocent man and a life changed forever. His arrest had prompted a media thirst, especially for intimate details about his life. He was variously vilified as strange, creepy, lewd and obsessed by death.
Reading those, and reading them in such a concentrated and pointed form for the first time, was very, very upsetting indeed.
Did you recognise at all the person they were reporting?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This was an entirely foreign personality that was being foisted on me.
Also in 2011, The Sun and the Daily Mail were found guilty of contempt of court for publishing photographs of a defendant in a murder trial because he was shown posing with a gun. Now, this photo wasn't related to the case and wasn't shown in court, and therefore could have influenced the jury against the defendant. You know, well, oh, he posed with a gun, well, he must be the sort to do this. Look, he's got a gun. In 2008, ITV News were fined $25,000 after they broadcast a piece about a trial of 5 men accused of murder and revealed that one of them had a previous murder conviction. Imagine how that could have influenced the trial. He's murdered someone before. And in that case, the trial had to be postponed and a whole new jury called, costing God knows how much money. Then of course we had the case of John Anthony Hill, otherwise known as Muad'Dib, who made the pretty crappy 7/7 conspiracy documentary 7/7 Ripple Effect about the London bombings. I've gone over my issues with that film a billion times before because of course I also made a London bombings documentary. But the point is, he sent his film to a judge and a jury foreman during the trial of alleged accomplices in the London bombings, which again is an obvious attempt to influence the trial. His case was a little more complex because I think he was based in Ireland and had to be extradited and things like that, but it's another clear example. In 2013, a juror was jailed for 2 months in prison, so he actually got prison time because he wrote on Facebook that he wanted to fuck up a paedophile. Fair enough, but this was before he'd heard the actual case and before the man was obviously convicted of being a paedophile. So he clearly showed his bias, and as a juror, he was also in the position to influence the rest of the jury. And an element that relates to Tommy Robinson's first case, the suspended sentence case, is that under contempt of court law, the unauthorised filming and picture taking within a court and its precincts is also considered contempt of court. It doesn't matter what you're filming, you're just not allowed to do it. It's a blanket ban. You can't film or take pictures inside of a court, and there are signs everywhere telling you not to do that. But that's what he did last year in Canterbury. He walked straight into the court building filming a video. Although it was a risk, that wasn't the issue this time because he was standing outside. He did go up to the steps. You know, there was a risk that he might do it again and he was live streaming. But the filming was more of an issue in his first case. But an example of that, in 2011, 19-year-old Paul Thompson was jailed for 2 months for taking a photo from the public gallery during a trial. So there was this young man sitting in the public gallery, his friend texted him, and he responded with a photo. It didn't really show anything, but that's how strict these laws are, and he got 2 months. Now when Tommy Robinson did it, he only got as far as the hallways, he didn't actually enter a courtroom. But then again, Tommy wasn't jailed, was he? He was given a suspended sentence. This young lad, who had no intention of doing anything wrong, he wasn't an activist, he wasn't, causing a scene, but he got 2 months in jail. Much worse than Tommy's original sentence. They take this seriously. It's strict liability, which means whether you're aware of the law or not, whether you intended to commit contempt of court or not, you'll still be punished for doing it. So, just take a step back and think about yourself. If you were accused of rape or any other crime, would you want the press dragging up all of your past dirt, suggesting that you must be guilty because of this thing that happened once or because of that, for whatever biased reason they come up with? Would you want to be confronted on the street or going to and from court with a camera someone shoving a camera in your face, shouting about your guilt, putting that clip on TV or the internet, or even live streaming it? Would you want someone in court snapping photos or messing about with the proceedings? My guess is no, you wouldn't want any of that. And that's why these laws exist. You're innocent until tried by a jury of your peers and proven guilty in a court of law. And nobody should interfere with that or even risk interfering with that. And I've seen it getting misconstrued. Oh, you're not allowed to report on court trials in the UK. That's not true. You're free to report on anything that happens in a trial. You just can't prejudice the trial. In fact, legally speaking, the media has what they call absolute privilege to go into court and cover what happens. As long as they do it fairly, as long as they report what the prosecution's case is and what the defence was, and they get all the details correct. They do that every single day. Journalists do that every single day. I've done it myself now. I reported on someone getting convicted for criminal damage at the local Crown Court because we have open justice in this country. The only difference, and this is where people are getting confused, the only difference with this grooming gang case is that the reports by journalists are postponed until all the trials are over. There were journalists in court while Tommy Robinson was outside messing about. They're covering this case. They've been covering this case since it first came to light. But until all the verdicts are back for each connected trial, you can't publish the details because it would prejudice the trial that's still ongoing, the trial that's still to come. You don't want a juror in the third trial thinking, well, if Bob was guilty already, then Jim in this trial must be guilty. There are lots of defendants in this case with overlapping evidence. That's why there's a postponement order, so everybody in that trial gets a fair trial. It's only a temporary reporting restriction. This isn't some kind of gag order on reporting about Muslim grooming gangs. That's just a stupid way to frame it. It will be reported on. Everything that happened in those courtrooms will be reported on. So I hope this is starting to make sense to everyone. Tommy posed a clear risk to the integrity of those trials. Now, last May, he was sentenced to 3 months suspended for 18 months. So he was a free man. As long as he didn't break the law again within those 18 months, he was free. And in my article up on wideshut.co.uk, I've linked to the full transcript of that sentencing, so you can read through it. And everything I talked about it has links within that article, if you want to do your own research. But as I said, he illegally filmed inside a court building, so that's the first problem. That's the first count, if you will, first instance of contempt of court. And then he also confronted defendants in that trial, calling them Muslim paedophiles and other prejudicial terms before they were found guilty, before they were tried in the court and proven to be that or not proven to be that. He then published this video from Canterbury Court online under the title Exposing Muslim Child Rapists. So he's clearly implying they were guilty before a jury came back with a verdict. He got off lightly there. People have said, oh, Tommy's being hard done by with these sentences. He got off lightly. He didn't see inside of a jail cell the first time. He wasn't even fined. He's only been jailed because he did it all over again. And this is what Judge Norton in that first case told him when he was summing up at the end there. And this is from the transcript. If you commit any further offence of any kind, and that would include, I would have thought, a further contempt of court by similar actions, then that sentence of 3 months would be activated. And that would be on top of anything else that you were given by another court. In short, Mr. Yaxley Lennon, because he actually goes by a fake name, Tommy Robinson isn't even his name, if you turn up at another court, refer to people as Muslim paedophiles, Muslim rapists and so on and so forth, while trials are ongoing and before there has been a finding by a jury that that's what they are, and you will find yourself inside. Do you understand? Clearly he didn't, or clearly he just blatantly ignored what the judge told him. And I'm not going to repeat exactly what he said or play a clip from that live stream, because in essence that would be repeating his crime. But you can find the live stream. There were several things he said during that stream that implied the defendants entering court were guilty before the verdict was reached. It wasn't as blatant as the first time, but the implication was still there. He also went up to one of the defendants and asked him how he was feeling about his verdict. Now, the verdicts weren't actually reached yet, but multiple times Tommy said and implied that he was there to report on the verdicts. So presumably he was going to stick around until they'd left court or not left court and reported on what happened. But there was a reporting restriction stopping people from doing that because it would prejudice the third trial. Remember, if Bob is already guilty, or innocent for that matter, then you might think Jim is guilty or innocent. So it wasn't about filming, it wasn't about just reporting on the case, it was about being prejudicial towards the trial. It was about his illegal actions while he was filming. He also said that some of the men who were in court were charged with crimes that they weren't charged with, because he was reading old news reports from the preliminary hearing at the magistrate's court. Things changed since then. So there were a lot of problems with what he was doing. So when you see Tommy's supporters saying, oh, he was just a journalist arrested for reporting on grooming gangs, yeah, that's not really how it happened, is it? He's an activist that was putting trials at risk. And you can't forget the live streaming element to all this. Remember, the law says if you create a risk of prejudice or impediment of court proceedings. If he was just filming a video that he was going to post online later, police, in theory, could have warned him that what he was doing was creating a risk. Look, you've got to delete this, you said this or that, clean all this up and get out of here. Maybe he would have avoided jail time. But he was live streaming. It's instantly published. The crime was instant. Thousands of people were watching live. What if he entered court like last time? He's proven himself to be a liability. What if he made his language even more prejudicial? What if it got to the point where verdicts were reached, he somehow got wind of that, he caught them leaving the court or whatever, and then he reported it to everyone when he's not supposed to? He's a risk. And Nasir Afzal, who's a senior lawyer, former prosecutor, who specialises in child sex crimes, he explained this risk on Twitter. He explained how this puts trials at risk. One of the more infamous cases, the Rochdale child rape case, grooming gang case, was nearly thrown out of court because of contempt and because of interference with these kinds of activists. This is what he wrote on Twitter. Their lawyers applied at their trial that the jury had been prejudiced by the far right. We had to fight to persuade the court to allow the trial to continue. Those criminals came close to being freed and victims close to getting no justice. The jury must decide on evidence, not your opinion. And just for the record, this guy's a Muslim. This is a guy who, after leaving the legal profession, now campaigns around these issues. He's one of the good guys trying to get justice, and he's saying Tommy Robinson is a liability when it comes to these cases, whether through ignorance or because he's got some other agenda, but he's not helping. Just because Tommy says, oh, I'm exposing grooming gangs, doesn't actually mean that that's what he's doing. It doesn't mean he's having a positive effect. Clearly, he's hindering these cases. You can say, oh, well, the law shouldn't be set up that way. Tommy should be allowed to do this kind of stuff. But it's not. And this is the system we're in. So whichever way you spin it, he's still not helping. In the example that I gave earlier, where the ITV News broadcast revealed that a defendant in a murder case had a prior conviction for murder, the trial for that was thrown out and postponed, and a new jury had to be called. That costs untold amounts of money. Do you want that happening in these cases? Or worse, do you want mistrials and people to be acquitted without the case itself determining that that's what should happen, but because it's been prejudiced? Where's the justice in that? Another example, many of you will remember this because it was really high profile at the time. In the early 2000s, there was these two Leeds professional football players, soccer players, who were on trial for what was deemed a racist assault on somebody. Lee Bowyer and Jonathan Woodgate. What do you know? Football hooliganism. Tommy Robinson should know all about that. But at the time, the Sunday Mirror were found guilty of contempt of court because they published an interview with the victim's father during the trial, which would prevent those two men, the two footballers, having a fair trial, because it gave sympathy to the Sun. This caused the whole thing to collapse, and new trials had to be set. So that's the risk of Tommy Robinson. That's what he could cause with all these trials. He used prejudicial statements implying they were guilty. He wanted to report on the eventual verdicts, which would have prejudiced the third trial in the series of connected trials, and he was on a suspended sentence for the same damn crime, proving that he's a risk. And that risk was made even worse because he was live streaming to thousands of people at the time. So when you dig through the exaggerations and the misinformation, it's quite easy to understand why he's now in jail for 13 months. Now, I updated the article on wideshut.co.uk with a sort of question and answer section, because there's a lot of claims being put out there by Tommy's supporters, by people in his team, that are worth addressing directly and clarifying, because people are still not understanding this, or they're just willfully ignoring the facts of what happened. But let's just go through it. So, how was he arrested for breach of the peace but charged with contempt of court? Well, Tommy was arrested on suspicion of breach of the peace, and once in custody the evidence would have been reviewed and he was subsequently held in contempt of court instead. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how all this works, people are arrested for one thing or on suspicion of one thing and charged with other offences all the time. It's pretty standard. As for breach of the peace itself, police have the power to arrest for a breach of the peace simply for a provocation. No violence has to occur. Even if the offender, the person arrested on suspicion or for breach of the peace, isn't violent themselves and somebody else reacts with violence, they can still be arrested, simply to dissolve the situation, to remove them from that situation. So running up to defendants as a known anti-Islam activist, confronting them, shouting about their guilt, using prejudicial language, trying to get the verdicts and report the verdicts, all of that is a clear provocation. And either way, it's a moot point because he did commit contempt of court and that's what he's charged with. The point is, that arrest was not out of the ordinary. It was well within the police powers to do that. Did Tommy get an unfair sentence? No, not at all. People are saying, oh, this is an unprecedented jailing for contempt of court. No one's been locked up for this long. Contempt of court carries a maximum of 2 years and an unlimited fine. He got off lightly with 13 months, considering that he was already on a suspended sentence for the same offence. So he had 2 counts of contempt of court. Remember what the judge said in the summing up? Your suspended sentence will be activated and that will be on top of any new offence that you commit. So he's committed 2 counts of contempt of court. And he hasn't been fined on either occasion. If he didn't break the law again, he would be a free man. There's nothing harsh about that. Remember our example of the 19-year-old who got 2 months for just taking a random photo that didn't really show anything? That was arguably a harsher sentence than what Tommy's dealing with. Why was he dealt with so quickly? He was imprisoned within 4 hours, 2 hours, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, depending on who you listen to. But no, it's not unprecedented. If you're held in contempt of court, which by its nature often happens at court, it's routinely dealt with quickly then and there. Again, in our example, the 19-year-old who took a photo inside the courtroom, he was arrested right then, taken down to the cells, charged, brought before a judge, and sentenced to 2 months. And that whole ordeal took place in under 2 hours. It was closer to 1 hour. If you were held in contempt of court, the judge just gets on with it. It's not unique to Tommy Robinson. Why didn't Tommy get a trial? He pleaded guilty. which means there's no need for a trial. He admitted and accepted his crime. He even apologized. If you plead guilty, you don't get a trial. It's a waste of money. Of course, there's some grey areas there with people with mental illness and things like that who maybe aren't aware of what they're doing, but does Tommy have a mental illness? No, he pleaded guilty. He doesn't get a trial. And regardless of that, contempt of court proceedings aren't dealt with by a jury anyway, just like many other summary offences that are dealt with solely by the judge, without a jury. Common assault is one example of a summary offence that's dealt with by a judge at a magistrate's court. Speeding is another example, all summary offences. Now, contempt of court is a bit unique. It's not a summary offence, but I'm just giving you examples that not every crime you're accused of requires a jury under the UK justice system. And this is a bit long-winded, but it explains the power to do this. The Crown Court is a superior court of record under the Senior Courts Act 1981, and accordingly has the power to punish for contempt of its own motion, providing the crime falls within disobedience of a court order. The reporting restrictions is a court order. He also had his suspended sentence and everything like that, so that falls under all that. Or it was in the face of the court, which it was. Quote, not to be taken literally, the judge does not need to see it, provided it took place within the court precincts or relates to a case currently before that court. The grooming gang trial. Where it is necessary to act quickly, the judge, even the trial judge, may act to sentence for contempt. So just to boil all that down, he wasn't entitled to a trial, and the judge was well within his right to try him then and there. Why? Because he was messing with a trial. That's how this works. I heard the judge only watched a few minutes of the video. How was this enough to convict him? Well, if we want to get down to the detail, the specific elements of the video where Tommy commits contempt of court only take place within about a minute of the video. There are some very specific actions, so the judge didn't necessarily have to watch the whole video. And again, this is also within the context of Tommy pleading guilty, which means he admits to the crime. We don't need a long drawn out analysis of the evidence. We don't need to call witnesses when he admits to it. The court appointed him a barrister instead of his own lawyer. He was given bad advice and railroaded. No one's guaranteed that their personal lawyer or solicitor is going to be there when they've been arrested or charged with a crime. He would have had a chance to contact this lawyer, certainly to phone them, and judging from the information that was put out by his team, there was contact made with this solicitor, even if they didn't make it there in person. He had the chance to get advice. He would have been given that opportunity. Everybody is given that opportunity. He would have been given access to another solicitor if he wanted one. And you've got to understand that these solicitors are independent of the court. They don't work for the court. They're not in cahoots. There's no conspiracy. If you can prove otherwise, go ahead. And to be clear, because this is being framed in all sorts of different weird ways, Tommy's personal solicitor has no audience rights in a Crown Court. So in other words, his solicitor is not allowed to actually defend him during the hearing. He's not qualified, or she's not qualified to do that. Like most people in that situation, he's represented by an experienced barrister, independent of the court, and given full legal advice. Defence barristers don't work for the court. They're independent. That's just how it works. The idea that this person, this barrister, is going to risk their career, all that hard work, why would they risk all that on Tommy Robinson on a contempt of court case? It's so cut and dry anyway. There's no need to throw him under the bus. This was a legitimate crime. This was a legitimate case. People are really clutching at straws with this. And look, if he feels hard done by, he can appeal, just like everybody else. The idea that he's just been screwed over doesn't make any sense. Oh, the judge who tried him was watching his stream and watching the arrest from a window from the court, so he shouldn't be the one to have tried him. Well, first off, this is hearsay put out there by Robinson's team. There's no way of actually proving that this judge was watching. There's this grainy image floating around, supposedly proving that this is the judge. But no, I mean, you can't tell. You can just about tell that it's a judge, but you can't identify who it was from that photo. And regardless, going back to one of our previous points there, judges who witness contempt are often the ones that instruct the arrest. They're often the ones that deal with the accused, because it's happening on their watch, it's happening at the court, it's impeding their proceedings. Now, if you can cite the law otherwise, please go ahead, tell me where I'm wrong. Prove your point. It's just sort of one of these made up things again, this misinformation that's being thrown out there. It doesn't matter if the judge did or didn't see what happened. None of this is unique to Tommy Robinson. The law applies to everyone. He isn't special. Nothing that's happened here is out of the ordinary. Now, you might want to dispute the law, you might want to dispute how the justice system works, but don't pretend that this is some kind of unprecedented thing where this innocent journalist was bundled off for a secret trial because of his political beliefs. That's just not what this is. If Tommy was a trained journalist, he'd know contempt of court law. It's one of the first things you learn. It's what I just learned. I just passed the test, the law exam a few months ago on this very subject. He could have phoned the court before he arrived, as journalists do every single day, to see what restrictions were in place. If he was actually a respected journalist instead of this activist that brings trouble wherever he goes, he could have gone inside the damn court and covered the case. But he's not a journalist, he's an activist, and an activist with a bad track record, and an activist that was on a suspended sentence for contempt of court.
Whose street? Our street! Whose street? Our fucking street!
Tommy Robinson! If you're watching this at home or from abroad, you can do it too. Do everything before everything is lost. If you're here in the United Kingdom, join us. Not in spirit, join us here. Boots on the ground. If you're abroad, demonstrate for Tommy outside the British embassies all over the world.
Behind me is the British Embassy in The Hague. And I'm here because I'm shocked and outraged. What happened in the United Kingdom last week is an absolute disgrace. Tommy Robinson, a freedom fighter and Islam critic, was jailed.
Am I misstating this? I mean, it sounds, and I know the pretext for this is that he was interfering with jurors, but he was speaking his views on a public street when he was arrested and convicted immediately and sentenced to over a year in prison. Am I mischaracterizing that?
You're not at all. That's exactly what happened.
And I see people saying, you can't stop talking about it because you're next. Yeah, you leftists rubbing your authoritarian hands together. They're all pissed that Tommy Robinson 11 years ago exposed the giant child kidnapping rings they're now confirmed.
Causing a disturbance? But he was standing by himself on the public street. In fact, Tommy had been just talking into his cell phone. He was doing a Facebook video live stream, and he had been doing it for literally 1 hour. I think the UK courts, well, they committed murder of their own reputation.
Whose street? Our fucking street!
If you want to talk about victim mentality, virtue signalling, there you have it. What a joke. And what annoys me most about this is that at the bottom of it, at its core, is the exploitation of people's genuine and justified anger. The exploitation of the victims and potential victims in these kinds of cases. People are being taken advantage of. There is an established problem of child grooming and rape gangs in this country, by men who use their warped Muslim ideologies to justify their sick crimes. They've dehumanized young white girls as fair game. And social workers and police and those with a duty of care within these communities have looked the other way and hindered justice because of a fear of racism and because of a fear of being labelled Islamophobic. That's true. That has been proven to be true. But none of it, as Alex Jones blabs on about, none of that was exposed by Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson didn't mount an investigation and write the exposés in the Times about grooming gangs in Rotherham. That was Andrew Norfolk. He won the 2013 Orwell Prize for Journalism because of it, and by all accounts he's deeply haunted by it all. Tommy Robinson just shouts about it on social media. He's a leech. He gets all of his information about these cases from the media and then frames it as the media aren't covering it. How dumb do you have to be? He goes out and causes publicity stunts that only inflate his own fame and the coffers and the agendas of those surrounding him. What has Tommy Robinson actually achieved? He's got hundreds of people to protest on Whitehall for Tommy Robinson. Not for anyone else, for Tommy Robinson. Thousands of petition signatures to free Tommy after he committed a clear crime and put grooming gang trials at risk of collapse. Why don't people understand that? All of that energy being harvested by Tommy Robinson. I should say Stephen Lennon, that's his real name. All of that energy being harvested by the Rebel Media, a Canadian activist media group, constantly putting out this disinformation to inflate the story and to use it for their agenda. Breitbart posting up this stupid redacted story to get hits. They know contempt law. They have London offices. They're journalists. They also know that most people on the street don't know contempt law, and they're going to use that to their advantage. Infowars vomiting all over the screen as usual. Do you know what the so-called mainstream media were doing while all these other outlets were framing this as the end of free speech and a political kidnapping and an unprecedented situation? They were challenging the reporting restrictions on Tommy Robinson. They're the ones that got that restriction lifted. Nobody in Tommy's corner were challenging the reporting restriction. Why? Because they were benefiting from the false narrative. They were benefiting from the sensationalism and the nonsense. They were able to fill the void with bullshit. It was Leeds Live and the Independent that got that reporting restriction removed. Because it wasn't needed. I'll give them that. It wasn't needed. It was stupid. It backfired. The judge was trying to stop people from committing the same kind of contempt of court, trying to stop this story from blowing up so the case wouldn't be jeopardised. Well, obviously backfired. And the mainstream media, who are supposed to have been complicit, they're the ones that got it lifted. So Tommy's narrative is just falling to bits. And look, I'm closer to the so-called new right, the alt-light, the classical liberal. I'm closer to that view on free speech than I am to the social justice warrior version of free speech. I'm closer to that than even the mainstream left version of free speech. I supported Count Dankula, the Nazi pug guy. I hate all this campus, college campus Antifa nonsense, this no platforming. You know, I know when people like Sargon of Akkad hold these free speech events, I know they're not literal Nazis. I get it. But I've not seen one of these commentators from that side of things. I've not seen one of them get this story correct. They're all fueling this false narrative. And whether that's because of ignorance or because they have an agenda, who knows? The rebel media certainly know what they're doing. The people that funded Tommy Robinson, the people that trained him, quote, in journalism, the big publicity stunters. They know what they're doing. Breitbart certainly know what they're doing. I'd assume someone like Stefan Molyneux, who interviews Lauren Southern, I'm pretty sure he knows what he's doing. And it's certainly not helping the victims of these grooming gangs. And look, I'm not some mainstream media supporter either. I've criticised the mainstream media for years. That's kind of what Wide Shut was all about. And they are, look, they are exploiting this too. They're taking advantage of this surge of interest in Tommy Robinson. They're churning out story after story to get the hits. You know, headlines like Meghan Markle's sister calls for Tommy Robinson's release. They'll report on anything related to it. They're playing the game too. And they are letting people down. They haven't gone to the lengths to explain why he was arrested and the full background to that. They just do it superficially. They just tell you that that's what happened in a sort of sneering manner. They get one quote and leave it at that. And then they call everyone who's protesting alt-right and Nazis and far-right and blah blah blah. They'd prefer to stir up those tensions and push people's buttons than have a genuine conversation, because controversy creates that traffic. It creates cash. Controversy creates cash, and the mainstream media at this point, they need cash. Anything that's got a surge in popularity, they're going to jump on. Not because they want to tell you the truth, not because they want to get to the heart of the matter, but because they need people to look at their pages and watch their broadcasts. So in my opinion, all around, this has just been one big circus. Everyone leeching off it and really forgetting about the victims in all of this. And before we go, because we're coming up on an hour, I just want to touch on, and I think this is an obvious question that people should be asking, but they're not asking, is who is Tommy Robinson? Who is this guy with all this attention? He's certainly been able to channel this working man's outrage. And like I said, there's a genuine anger there, but it's being channeled into the false narrative. And I think it would be naive to assume that just because Tommy Robinson gives off this sort of man on the street vibe, the working class hero, I think it would be naive to assume that that's what he actually is. I think that's what he's trying to portray. I think he knows who he's trying to attract, but I don't think that's what he actually is. The mainstream media never really do much digging into this. So they're happy just calling him far right, football hooligan, racist. They don't really get down into the detail. In fact, a lot of the times they sort of equate him with the far right and Nazism and fascism and all that kind of stuff. But actually, since the very early days of the English Defence League, Tommy Robinson has been pro-Israel, right? Do you understand how that connection works? Because he's anti-Islam. So of course he's going to be pro-Israel. So of course certain hardline Zionists and Israeli money, Jewish money, is going to make its way into that group. And I think when you get down to that, then you really start to see where the money's flowing from. Rebel Media is a Jewish-owned outfit, and that's not some anti-Semitic thing. It's just a fact. You go back to the early money behind the EDL, Alan Lake, this rich businessman, saying how he wanted to use the football lads, the hooligans, to be the on-the-street army against Islam. The Pamela Gellers in America that invited Tommy over. The trips they all took with Gavin McInnes and the Rebel Media staff to Israel. There's political agenda behind all of this. The English Defence League wasn't founded by football hooligans in the pubs, in the terraces, after football games. It was founded in Alan Lake's expensive London apartment. Or should I say Alan Ayling. They all have different names. They all use fake names. Anders Breivik, the nationalist terrorist who murdered 77 in Norway on July 22, 2011, was a keen follower of the anti-jihadist bloggers featured on Ayling's website. Breivik praised the EDL in his manifesto and posted on forums linked to the group. Following the Norwegian terror attack, Ayling was actually questioned by police, keen to establish whether he might be the mysterious English mentor Richard the Lionhearted, of whom Breivik speaks admiringly in his sprawling manifesto. Whilst Ayling was released without charge by police, some continue to allege that he is indeed Richard the Lionhearted. Most prominent amongst them is Paul Ray, a disgruntled former EDL member who had been present at the group's founding meeting in Ayling's flat. Ray had the misfortune to also blog using the name Lionheart, and so naturally he became a person of interest to the authorities in the aftermath of the attack. He flew voluntarily to Norway from his home in Malta to be interviewed by police, and continues to claim that he was set up by Alan Ayling, who he believes to be the real Richard the Lionhearted. Ayling made sure to publicly condemn Breivik's attack, but also described it as chickens come home to roost. He wasn't the only member of the EDL to exploit the Norwegians' murderous attack. Ayling's friend Roberta Moore headed the EDL's Jewish division until she became a little too outspoken about her extremist anti-Islam and pro-Zionist beliefs. A Brazilian-born Jew, Moore is believed to have been responsible for Stephen Lennon, Tommy Robinson's, appearance at the September 2011 EDL demonstration, which he was banned from. He only managed to sneak in by absurdly disguising himself as a rabbi. Moore's comments during Breivik's trial were highly disturbing. In April 2012, she wrote an article published on the Jewish Defence League's UK blog in which she described Breivik's trial as a kangaroo court and defended him against charges of child murder by repeating his defence that the victims had actually been young adults attending an indoctrination camp who were not innocent. She stated, "I hold the same amount of sympathy for those in the attack as I would if somebody committed this act on a Hitler youth camp in the 1940s. Or were they just children as well?" The EDL did not distance themselves from Moore's outrageous comments, and for some time she continued to run their official Jewish Division Facebook page to spread her anti-Muslim message. And that there was just a bit of an extract from a pretty old article now on Wide Shut by former contributor Brit D, Mr. Brit. Some of you may remember him from Resistance Radio. But that was just some of the digging that he did at the time, and you can find that article in the show notes as well. So I think it would be naive to just assume that Tommy Robinson doesn't have any political motive and doesn't have anyone behind the scenes pushing him in different directions. Ultimately, he was arrested for a clear and obvious crime. He committed contempt of court. And all those falling for the hype, marching in the streets, might want to reread the tale of the Pied Piper. Keep it locked here on wideshut.co.uk. I've been Keelan Balderson, and I'll catch you next time on the Wide Shut webcast.